Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices for our webinar program entitled International Medication Safety Update. My name is Matthew Grissinger. I'm the Director of Education at IMSN, and I will be your host for today's program. Around the world, numerous organizations are tirelessly working to make medication use systems safer. While the focus of these organizations may differ, they all share a common goal of ensuring that patients around the world have access to safe medications provided by knowledgeable healthcare professionals and organizations working with the right tools under the guidance of just leadership and governance. Now more than ever, it is important for these organizations to work together in order to identify and respond to emerging preventable medication adverse drug events, share best practices for safe medication use, and work to engage patients as an integral part of the healthcare system. Errors are rarely unique to an individual practitioner, patient care unit, hospital, or geographic region. It's only through open communication, sharing of medication errors, their causes, and the risk that we can learn from one another, share best practices, and advance patient safety on a global scale. This webinar will discuss how organizations around the world interact with and complement one another with a focus on the International Medication Safety Network, or IMSN, an international network of established safe medication practice centers who monitor for adverse drug reactions and medication errors and produce guidance to minimize preventable harms for medication use in practice. There will be discussion of ongoing global medication safety initiatives and review of some topics of interest from recent international meetings and work groups. We'd like to thank Novartis Name Creation and Regulatory Strategy for the generous support of this program. So some quick housekeeping tips, everyone. This program is being recorded and will be available on the IMSN website. Handouts for today's program can be found using the link provided in the reminder email, as well as the chat box that you'll see below. So if you go in your chat box right now, you'll see a link to get the handouts. All attendees are in listen mode only during the presentation. Feel free to ask a question by accessing the Q&A functionality on your toolbar. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. All right, so I can go to slide 2. We'll go over the objectives for the program for today. We're going to review 4 organizations that have a focus on medication safety around the world, identify how these organizations cooperate with one another to share expertise and best practices, understand the importance on collecting adverse event reports and signal detection for identifying emerging medication risks, and identify 5 current global medication safety initiatives. And now it's with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker for today's program. It's Tyler Nichols. Tyler received his Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in Albany, New York in 2010. After completing his degree, he started his pharmacy career at a small community hospital in Albany, where he had his first experience as a medication safety officer. Working with interdisciplinary teams, he worked to review medication events and publish best practices to identify system solutions to help enhance healthcare workers' ability to provide safe care to their patients. He also helped provide education to nursing and provider staff on multiple topics, including just culture and the importance of reporting medication events. After 7 years, Tyler moved on to work at Albany Medical Center, a large academic tertiary care center that serves a vast population of adult, pediatric, and neonatal patients ranging across much of upstate New York. The hospital included both a level 1 trauma center that sees more traumas than any other hospital in New York, surgical, medical, and cardiac intensive care units, a level 3 neonatal intensive care unit, in addition to several other specialty care areas. There, he took on a role as a pharmacy supervisor, primarily overseeing sterile product compounding operations, including hazardous and nuclear pharmacy. During his time at Albany Medical Center, he took on multiple responsibilities, including participating in safe medication use, dietary, USP 800, and nursing council work groups. At the Albany Medical Center, as the Albany Medical Center transitioned to the Albany Med Health System, Tyler helped coordinate and oversee system-level integration from multiple sites to ensure compliance with USP regulatory guidelines at both inpatient and outpatient sites. He also took a leading role in monitoring and developing solutions to overcome ongoing product and material shortages. So one last thing here, I'm gonna launch the polling question. And if you can't, just get an idea, everyone, of where people are coming from around the world. Love to get an idea of where everyone's coming from. So in the poll, you should tell us what country, what continent you're from and you're calling from. And in about a couple seconds, we'll start the program for Tyler. And I just put this, thank you for the question, you Q&A box. I just put the link for the handouts in the chat box now that we started. Hey, Tom, I'm going to end the poll now. We have a lot of people here, and you'll see that majority are from North America, but we definitely have representation from throughout the world, except Oceania. So Tyler, on that note, I'll leave this up to you.
All right, thanks, Matt. And thank you all for joining the webinar today from around the world. I kind of didn't expect any of our folks from Australia and New Zealand to be joining us today because I think it's very, very early in the morning for them. But as Matt alluded to, my goal for today is to discuss how various international entities are working independently, but also collaboratively, and always with the same goal of safer provision of healthcare around the world. Now, there are certainly more than 5 organizations doing this around the world. We're going to focus on some of the organizations that ISMP works with in order to focus efforts surrounding safe use of medications. And we'll look at some of their safety initiatives and some of the projects they've been working on. Namely, we're going to be discussing the International Medication Safety Network, or IMSN, the International Society of Pharmacovigilance, or ISOP, the World Health Organization, of course, or WHO, the Uppsala Monitoring Center, or UMC, and then the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, or SIOMS, because that's just a mouthful. Now, when I first started thinking about this topic, really I was imagining multiple moons orbiting the same planet. So you have all these organizations around the world. They all have slightly different roles and different areas of focus, some broad, some much more narrow. However, they all have the overarching goal of enhancing medication safety and patient safety, which is the planet that they're orbiting. Now, if we take a closer look at that planet, you'll see that there's 3 kind of main pillars or topics that we think about when we talk about patient safety and medication safety. So we're gonna look a little bit at safe medications, how the medications themselves are safer for use, the people and culture surrounding healthcare, and then the technologies and processes. I think those 3 things all come together. And then at the core of that little Venn diagram there is where we see our patients. So all these things have intricate interactions with one another, but they all have the same main goal of increasing patient safety. As I was looking through this topic, this quote from Winston Churchill really stuck out to me because I think it really embodies what we're talking about today. And it's that those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. As somebody who worked in healthcare and here in the States, I always knew that errors were always or were rarely ever unique to an individual practitioner, a patient care area, or a hospital or a region of the States. But working with international medication safety, I've come to realize that that expands beyond just a state or a country. It goes well into a worldwide state. So as you'll see as we move along, the problems that we see here in the States or you see over in Europe or Asia or Africa are the same things that are being seen around the world. So nothing is really unique. And really, it's only through that open and just communication of medication errors that we can learn from one another, share our best practices, and advance patient safety on a global scale. Now, as we look at goals and tools used for promoting the safe use of safe medications, it's always important to keep in mind that what may work in one area does not always work in another. We here in the United States have lots of technologies, compounding robots and things like that might not be available in other parts of the world. We heavily utilize barcode scanning, but we know that that's not something that's happening all around the world either. So as we look at recommendations for improving global medication safety, we always have to balance our recommendations with the capabilities of other areas. For example, who's preparing medications? Do you have a centralized pharmacy with an ISO 5 clean room suite, or are all of your IVs being made by nurses or other caregivers on the units themselves? What technologies do you have available to you? And what kind of drug products do you see even? We'll talk a little bit later about the differences between some of the products, vials versus ampules, and how those are different in different areas of the world, and how that has an impact on some of our safe recommendations. Even here in the States, we know that some places are still using paper orders and not using computerized physician order entry or CPOE. So we can't assume that everybody's embracing the same technologies equally, and we need to keep that in mind. With that in mind, I do want to give a shout out to one of ISMP's 2022 Cheers Awards winners that we just had last week, the Shifa International Hospital in Islamabad, Pakistan, for their ability to develop a creative solution for implementing camera-assisted verification for chemotherapy admixture services with limited resources and funding. It's a great example of an institution looking for creative ways to implement an ISMP targeted medication safety best practice that work within their specific situation in order to improve patient safety. So the first organization we're going to be discussing today is the International Medication Safety Network, or IMSN. As you can see here, IMSN first met in Salamanca, Spain in 2006 to set their charter and define their commitment to the prevention of medication errors across the world. At this meeting, they created the Salamanca Declaration to promote safe medication practices globally. And that declaration recognized the key tenets of medication safety. I'm going to paraphrase these because it's a very, very long document. You can find it on the website. But ultimately, adverse drug reactions and medication errors cause harm. They do not discriminate based on lines drawn on maps, and collaboration must exist in order to share local learning globally. Medication errors are complex and involve systems issues, and confidential, non-punitive, and independent medication error reporting and learning systems are critical to identifying issues. And finally, and most importantly, patients are at the center of medication safe practices. So IMSN is currently made up of 25 member countries, and it's a mixture of national regulatory agencies and nonprofit safety organizations. The membership also includes regulatory agencies like the European Medicines Agency, the US FDA, and the Saudi FDA. Some other observers, such as UMC and WHO. So again, you see that collaboration already with different agencies working together, even within one particular institution. And then we do have industry associates that also sit in and help us from Baxter, Novartis, and Pfizer. So you may be you're likely familiar with ISMP's targeted medication safety best practices. If not, we'll discuss some of them a little later on in the presentation. But similarly, IMSN has their own version with a more global perspective. Again, with a focus on safety enhancements that balance safety with global capabilities. Currently, IMSN has identified 4 such best practices that you see here on the screen. You can find more information on these on the IMSN website, and there will be links to all the websites for these organizations towards the end of the presentation as well. But the first 4 that IMSN has worked on were removing potassium chloride concentrate injection from drug storage areas on all inpatient nursing units and wards. And this decreases that risk of somebody inadvertently getting an IV push of concentrated, say, potassium chloride, which can cause cardiac arrest and death. The second of their best practices is preparing and dispensing vinca alkaloids like vincristine in a mini bag and never in a syringe. Because we know that when that medication is given by an intrathecal injection, which other medications as part of that chemotherapy regimen normally are, it can almost always cause death in the patient. So putting it in a bag is always safer than a syringe. The third is preventing inadvertent daily dosing of methotrexate for non-oncologic conditions. And we know this is something that we still struggle with. We still see reports of it here in the States, and you'll see later that other countries are working on this goal as well. So it's still an ongoing issue. And then preventing errors related to the improper preparation of 2-component vaccines. If you follow ISMP's newsletters for acute care, I think we just put out an article recently acknowledging some manufacturers changing their 2-component vaccines to a single component vaccine. The errors that we see with the 2 components are usually they're provided as one lyophilized powder vial and then a diluent vial. And that diluent vial can be inactive diluent, or it can be an actual component of the vaccine. So patients getting only one portion of that vaccine due to mistakes and mix-ups or missing one of those vials continue to occur. So always going to be safer if you can get that vaccine in a one component, but coming up with ways to prevent error when you do still need to deal with those two component vaccines. So outside of those four, IMSN is currently working on its fifth best practice. And that best practice is the safe use of oxytocin. So while oxytocin has uses in both the antepartum and postpartum care, improper administration can lead to fetal distress, the need for emergency cesarean section, or uterine rupture. And a few maternal, fetal, and neonatal deaths have been attributed to these types of errors. Since the mid-1990s, IMSN has been publishing safety alerts related to errors with oxytocin. And this past year, we added safeguarding against errors with its use as an IMSN targeted medication safety best practice. To take that initiative further, we teamed up with IMSN to see what others around the world were seeing, and not surprisingly, we were not alone, and it was determined to take this best practice to the global stage. So we've been working with representatives from around the world to identify common and unique issues surrounding the use of this high-risk medication. So far, we've had presentations from the US, Canada, UNC, France, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, and coming soon, the National Health Service in the UK and Saudi Arabia, kind of part two. They're going to give us some more information on what they found. And we're working on compiling a global safe practices list surrounding the use of oxytocin during labor and delivery. And the goal here is going to be identifying safety enhancements at every stage of the medication use process, really from procurement and planning all the way through administration. We've seen some interesting information coming out of our presentations from member countries. When we talk about procurement and planning, we're looking to make sure, what are we doing in times of shortage? How are we best preserving product and making sure that we have product to begin with? I think it was IMSN Canada had a really great presentation of great materials on patient education that starts way before the mother goes into labor. Looking at educating patients and mothers and whole families on what oxytocin is, what its uses are, what its risks are. So those things are known before they're in labor and in that situation where things might get a little hectic and a little confusing. So patient education is a huge component of this, of course. And we talk about storage, how these medications are available on patient care units, when they're available at the bedside, how the bags are looking. If you have multiple concentrations, how are those stored and differentiated from one another? So all of those things are coming up. For example, with storage, what kind of other medications are available on those units that can be confused? Similar looking or sounding names like oxytocin and ondansetron, both available in small vials, both start with O, might be together alphabetically on a shelf somewhere. So looking at how things are stored and how they're not mistaken for one another. Then we talk about preparation. Where are these things being prepared? Do you have a pharmacy making a standard concentration, or are these being made at the bedside for patients? Are you able to purchase from an outside compounder so you don't have to compound it at all yourself? So looking at sort of how you're doing that. Then we talk about prescribing. An interesting presentation out of Singapore, they described verbal orders for Syntocin, which is the brand name for an oxytocin product, versus Syntometrin, which is a combination of oxytocin and ergometrin, which we call methyl ergonavine here in the States. But both of them have the prefix of Synto. So prescribers ordering Synto at the bedside without actually saying which medication they're looking for. So similar to issues we see again here in the States and everywhere around the world, using brand name medication abbreviations can lead to confusion and wrong drug errors. So very interesting reports coming out of other countries for that. And then administration, what about smart pumps? Absolutely. Our recommendations for IMSN have information in there about guide rails and smart pump programming. But again, when we're looking on a global scale, we need to acknowledge what is available and what's able to be done everywhere. So in addition to these targeted best practices, IMSN and IMSN collaborated during the COVID pandemic to identify risks and develop best practices for use of COVID-19 vaccines on a global scale. Oh, sorry, I advanced a little too early there. Let me go back. So we are still working on the Oxytocin special interest group. We're compiling the list of all the recommendations that we're coming across through our discussions with the group. And hopefully sometime in the first quarter or second quarter of next year, we hope to be pushing out that recommendation onto the IMSN website. So going back to this, just we did put out a COVID-19 vaccine interest group document about how to use COVID-19 vaccines safely. So the link here is on the website. And we also have a link here to the ISMP website for our COVID-19 resources as well. But it just shows another way that we were able to collaborate with one another during a time of crisis and come out with best practices with input from people from around the world. And IMSN did just have its annual meeting just about exactly 1 month ago, actually, back on November 14th and 15th. We had updates from member countries and included presentations from groups like Swissmedic, WHO, ISOP, UNC, the Saudi FDA, and the US FDA as well. So over the next few slides, I'm going to go over some of the highlights, or what I call noteworthy notables from the presentations. Obviously, it was a 2-day meeting. I can't go through all of the details, but I really picked out some of the highlights that I thought were worth mentioning because they really do show how the issues that are seen here in the States are seen around the world, and the issues seen around the world are seen here in the States. So I think as I read through these, you'll recognize some of them as problems that maybe you're dealing with as well. So our friends in Hong Kong presented on improving warfarin safety. Obviously, something that is an issue around the world is how we safely administer and monitor and help these patients with the coagulation disorders. So certainly not something that's new or unique to them. New Zealand discussed issues with the lack of regulations enabling formalized medication error reporting. We see here in the States differences in regulations from state to state about mandatory reporting and how medication errors are reported through systems and utilized to improve medication use. So certainly something that we're not unfamiliar with here as well, but something that they're working on and trying to make sure that they have the regulation to improve that process. ISMP Canada had some really great presentations on labeling improvements for mineral supplements. I know we see errors and reports coming through with how we express doses for things like calcium supplements as the mineral of calcium versus the calcium salt, and confusion that can occur when transitioning from inpatient to outpatient. So something certainly that we would like to see here in the States, and I'm sure around the world, is how these things are labeled consistently so that they can improve patient safety. They also saw emerging issues with the compounding of commercially available products due to shortages. I think there were some issues with compounding of liquid acetaminophen and some of the antibiotics that have been on back order recently. So what sort of errors are coming out of these shortages, which I'm sure everybody around the world is familiar with that terminology, how we are ensuring that we have medication to provide patients in times when we don't have it available commercially. And on top of that, they discussed a very unfortunate case that involved a pediatric death related to the incorrect compounding of a tryptophan product using a baclofen active pharmaceutical ingredient, and the need for better labeling and identification of API. And ultimately, that topic led to a much larger discussion at the meeting, and ultimately it grew into a consideration of that topic as the next global medication safety best practice goal. So that we'll talk about that in a few slides, as well as what our next goals are for IMSN, but that was certainly one that we all felt very deeply about, that it was worth looking further into. Move on, our friends at ISMP Spain discussed improved recommendations for medication reconciliation in primary care. And as we all know, if it's not done or not done well or not done correctly or fully, medication reconciliation is a very large risk, or has a very large risk for medication errors. And also they were updating recommendations concerning the high alert medications, putting out in multiple languages so it could be used in different areas. Our friends in Oman discussed enhancing the role of medication safety officers. You'll see that this is a goal that a lot of organizations around the world are working on, because we're seeing that having a dedicated medication safety officer and not just a part-time person or not just shared responsibilities, somebody who can really focus on system improvements, identifying and mitigating risks, and looking for those external resources is of great benefit to patients and medication safety. Morocco discussed an interesting event involving a patient who accidentally overdosed on acetaminophen, thinking that it was ibuprofen. Because of that suffix, that sounding of fen, and the fact that in that part of the world, acetaminophen is normally known as paracetamol. And in fact, a lot of, I believe, Europe and other parts of the world use the generic name paracetamol. But because global medications are available globally, and maybe it was a shortage, that patient received generic named acetaminophen and was taking it as they would ibuprofen, which led to an overdose. And the EMA discussed, of course, issues with COVID-19 vaccine labeling, differences between those first batches that came out and the final approved labeling, which we all struggled with. And even going forward, the new age-related dosage forms that are coming out, and the new bivalent boosters, and all these things that we've discussed in some of our ISMP newsletters about the appearance of the vials, confusion between the regimens and the different age groups. So certainly a lot of issues that we're all struggling with and continue to struggle with around those vaccines. The French network of pharmacovigilance centers discussed AVRs related to drug shortages, just like we talked about earlier. Again, different countries having similar problems all coming out at this meeting. Our friends in France at Prescrire discussed mix-ups with tranexamic settings. And this was interesting because some of the recommendations that came out were to switch the product from a vial formulation to an ampule formulation to try and better differentiate between some of the products that were being mistaken. But in discussing it further, it came out that in many parts of the world, including Europe and France, a lot of the medications are available as ampules. So switching to an ampule would only make it look just like other medications that are already in that formulation there. And we'll talk a little bit more about ampules and how they relate to medication safety in a few slides as well. And then China was discussing errors involving thrombin lyophilized powder being given intravenously instead of topically due to vial packaging. And this is something that we struggle with here in the States, and I know all around the world. When medications are put into presentations that look like another route, they cause issues with administration. So we see issues with, sub-Q and IM medications going IV because it's in a vial that has to be drawn out of, or even oral medications provided in an IV vial. There are risks with these types of formulations that are given in the formulation container that doesn't match the actual route. So something that was definitely interesting to see that's happening everywhere. Norway discussed initiatives for reducing opioid-related death, which again is something that I know we all struggle with. It's definitely a big topic here in the States. Denmark discussed methotrexate electronic prescribing warnings. Again, I know that's one of the IMSN and it's an ISMP targeted medication safety best practice. Making sure those patients who are getting that once a week for rheumatoid arthritis are not getting it every day or not mistakenly being prescribed daily doses that can lead to severe toxicities. And lastly, our friends in Brazil discuss issues with receiving medication shortage relief shipments from other countries that came to them with different languages and in different concentrations than they're used to seeing. So again, these issues that we're seeing with drug shortages sometimes cause us or require that we receive medications from other parts of the world that weren't intended for our use. I know previously in my practice, I remember a shortage of sodium phosphate where we had to ship in, or the FDA brought in products from Europe of sodium glycerophosphate. So a formulation we weren't used to seeing in a concentration we weren't used to seeing. So we had to figure out how to use that formulation in our compounding practices. And on top of that, didn't have barcodes, which we were used to seeing on all of our products. So we had to come up with creative solutions to make sure we were using it safely in our systems when it really wasn't meant to be used in our systems. So something, again, that is a global struggle that we're going to continue to have to deal with. And as promised, ampules or ampules, depending on where you are in the world, you might spell it in multiple different ways. But throughout several discussions with IMSN members regarding the safe use of products, such as neuromuscular blockers or preventing those mix-ups that look like, sounded like products in patient care areas, discussions of variances in product availability in vials versus ampules in different parts of the world have come up. For example, For our neuromuscular blockers here in the state, we have regulations that require that they have that paralytic warning on the cap and also on the aluminum ferrule. However, in other parts of the world where those medications are available, you don't have that same capability to put that type of warning on those ampules. And while we still see issues with lookalike vials with similar cap colors, we see them coming in through ISMP on an almost a daily basis. Ampules represent different types of issues. They're usually on clear glass. Sometimes the writing can be difficult to read. If the text is wrapping around the ampule instead of vertically on the ampule, it can be hard to see the whole drug name when you're looking at the little tiny thing. And the small size can certainly exacerbate that as well. So at this point, I want to give another shout out to the recipient of the George D. Demizio Award at our ISMP Cheers Awards last week. Vitalis, a pharmaceutical company based in Colombia, after recognizing potential safety issues with their line of products provided in ampules, they reached out to safety organizations like ISMP for some guidance. So on the slide, you can see on the left side, their original products. And as you can see, those are all different products, but it's really hard to tell when they're lined up next to each other, with blue text on a clear background, difficult to read. And then on the right side, you can see their redesigned safer labels with color differentiation between products and strengths, white backgrounds to improve contrast, more legible text, and a vertical orientation so you can see the whole drug name without having to spin the ampule around. Very, very impressive changes. This is definitely something that stuck out to me as a bold move in medication safety. So something that was definitely worthy of recognition. So thank you, Vitalis, for that. So what's next for IMSN? We're searching for our next project. We did discuss this at our meeting last month. Neuromuscular blocking agents is certainly something that's at the forefront, something we have as a medication safety best practice here in the States through ISMP, but something we think might be worthwhile to obviously discuss on a global scale. But again, as I mentioned, that pharmacy compounding safety that came out of the discussion with ISMP Canada was also a topic that we were thinking about. So we're working on putting together goals for both of those and seeing which we're going to focus on in the coming year. And we're also looking to expand membership in other areas of the world that might not have representation with IMSN, more areas in South America, more areas in Asia that might not be represented. So trying to bolster and get more input from different perspectives around the world. So earlier we discussed the importance of safe medications. While groups like ISMP usually look at safe use of medications and the systems in which they're used, many other organizations like ISOP, or the International Society of Pharmacovigilance, have more of a focus on pharmacovigilance and the identification of important medication adverse effects. So I'll start with a disclaimer here. I am not an expert in pharmacovigilance, but in working with ISOP, I've certainly gained a better understanding and appreciation for it. And mainly the thing that stuck out to me is that the main concepts between monitoring for adverse effects is similar to what we practice for monitoring for medication errors, and that both rely heavily on individual reports to spark further investigations into a particular adverse event or safety system issue. It only takes a single report to start the cascade effect, so that signal detection is critical here. Really, pharmacovigilance was birthed out of the thalidomide situation back in the 1930s and 40s, when the medication was recognized for resulting in congenital abnormalities. So again, one person seeing that an event was occurring, monitored for observations compared to what they're expecting, then asking others to see if they're also identifying that. So that's sort of the heart and soul of pharmacovigilance, at least in the way that I've come to understand it. But really, pharmacovigilance was also, the importance of it was highlighted during the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, where we had the entire world getting vaccinated very rapidly. So never before has that much of a medication been used on a global scale as rapidly as it was being used. So the ability to identify risks quickly was incredibly important. And out of that came identification of those vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia events and myocarditis associated with some vaccines. So the ability to filter through all of that information to come out and identify what was being caused by which vaccine is really incredible that it was done. And I think there were pharmacovigilance experts around the world working around the clock to monitor these medications and these vaccines to find out what the risks were. And also ISOP looks into pharmacoepidemiology, phytopharmacovigilance, which I found to be interesting, looking at the adverse effects resulting from herbal supplements and other traditional medications. And also ecopharmacovigilance, which is actually a new special interest group with ISOP, where they're actually looking not at the safety of medication use for patients, but the effects of those medications on the environment, which ultimately comes back to affect the patients. So both through manufacturing and also just through human use of medications, how those medications are impacting water systems around the world and other ecosystems. So an interesting look into that world, which there likely aren't enough people working in. So very, very important that ISOP is taking that on as a new interest group. So I was very lucky to have been able to attend this year's ISOP annual meeting this past September in Verona, Italy, not just because I got to go to Italy, but because all of the presentations were incredibly interesting and truly mind-expanding. The theme of the conference was a new era of pharmacovigilance, challenges and opportunities. And I've listed some of the main topics on the conference here. Things that particularly stuck out to me. I don't have, again, I'm certainly not an expert in all of these topics, but it's worth mentioning some of them here. Again, the lessons learned from COVID-19 was a big topic throughout the entire conference. Again, the importance of vaccine surveillance and pharmacovigilance, and also really communicating risk in a crisis, how we as healthcare professionals evaluate data, evaluate the risks, and then provide non-biased information to the masses in a world where information overload is certainly a thing, and trying to put out valid information without scaring people, but with also just make sure they have the right information to make educated decisions themselves, fighting against misinformation and things of that nature. So a very interesting topic of how we communicate risk in a crisis. Also innovative approaches to post-marketing surveillance. Again, not an expert on multi-omics, but very interesting way to identify biological markers for predicting adverse events. So looking at genomics, epigenomics, transcriptomics, proteomics, and microbiomics, and see how all those systems within the human body take part in an adverse event, in an effort to see how you might be able to predict somebody who has similar genomics or whatever it might be from having an adverse event in the future. So I think we've always thought of medication adverse events as unpredictable events versus medication errors as predictable, but there's a lot of work going on to maybe change that a little bit so that you might be able to more easily predict which patients are going to have an adverse reaction to a certain medication or vaccine. So very interesting there. The growth of big data or real world data and the need for use of artificial intelligence, really artificial intelligence ability to pull together different data systems and identify trends much quicker than a human being could possibly by looking through a data set. And really just the growth of large amounts of patient data coming through registry systems and tracking systems as we look for adverse reactions to medications. There's also several discussions about medications for women's global challenges and initiatives in that patient population. Contributions to pharmacovigilance to healthy medical prescribing, how healthcare professionals should be, again, evaluating the data on adverse reactions to a medication, and then maybe using caution when a medication comes out and hasn't been used long enough, sticking to other medications that they're more familiar with if you have different options to treat a patient, and then waiting to see what comes with a new medication rather than jumping to use right away. Advances in phytopharmaceutical education and pharmacy curricula. I know that I probably didn't get a whole lot of education on phytopharmaceuticals throughout my career in pharmacy. So it's definitely interesting to see more pharmacy schools starting to embrace that topic. So we're better prepared to answer questions when it comes to use of those items. And of course, they talked about the future. They focused on the 4 Ps that they're hoping medicine will become in the next decade or two, being predictive, proactive, personalized, and participatory. And really changes in how we approve and evaluate new medications, using that big real world data and AI to evaluate that data and find trends quicker with medications. So we saw a little bit of that with the kind of a novel path for COVID-19 vaccine rollouts, where vaccine development typically took or takes about 12 years. But with this pandemic, we saw really a need for speed. So an overlapping of trial phases to shorten timelines, diversification, not putting all your eggs in one basket, trying multiple options simultaneously. And the other thing that was really novel was we were seeing vaccines from one part of the world being used to treat patients on the other side of the world. So in normal circumstances, a vaccine developed in Asia would be used in Asia. A vaccine developed in Africa would be used in Africa. But we saw these vaccines being used in different patient populations all around the world, which really strengthened the need for adverse event reporting and tracking, because you're using these vaccines in populations that differ from what they might have been tested in. So there might be different reactions not caught in those initial phases. So more need than ever to share those outcomes, more need to standardize how we share those outcomes. So this map from 2019 shows that we already realized that we needed a centralized and standardized program for adverse events following immunization monitoring, with the goal of improved collaboration and data sharing between vaccine manufacturers, national regulatory agencies, and immunization programs like the WHO expanded program on immunization. Currently throughout the world, we see a mix of immunization programs, whether it's the WHO, EPI, national regulatory agencies, a mixture of the two, organizations like the FDA or the CDC, or in some cases, not at all. So we definitely see that and I think in the past 3 years, we've improved these systems, or these systems have been improved, I should say. But it definitely was something that needed to happen during COVID. We needed to have better communication and sharing of that information. Another interesting topic that came up at the annual meeting for ISOB, and it also relates to the COVID vaccine rollout a little bit, is how we look at how we monitor new medications for adverse effects. So this concept of adaptive licensing. And so on the top side of the screen here, you'll see kind of what the current scenario is, where a medication goes through the 3 stages of randomized controlled trials, gets approval, and then you see rapid use, growth of use in the intended patient population. So that big blue part of the graph. You will see some ongoing observational studies and randomized controlled trials, but the most amount of use is not in a tracked form where you can more closely monitor for those adverse effects that might be rare and haven't been caught in the initial randomized controlled trials. Contrasting with the adaptive licensing form, which is similar to kind of what we saw with COVID a little bit, where you see an expedited or overlapped randomized controlled trial period, followed by an initial licensure with the majority of patients still continuing on in randomized controlled trials and other sorts of observational studies or registries. And then after that, full licensure, which then allows for use in the greater population. So what this does is it allows more tracking of that initial use in greater populations to get more real world data, but be able to more closely track it and not have to rely on those spontaneous reports or signal detection. So while ISOB does have a focus on pharmacovigilance, they do also have a special interest group focused on medication errors, which ISNP does collaborate with. So some of the programs that they've been working on include a medication safety officer program, similar to what we discussed earlier, the importance of having that MSO role. So their aim is to develop a training curriculum for these folks with a focus on the ISOP working principles. So if folks around the world are working on improving or increasing the number of MSOs, and this group is looking at trying to build a good education tool to use to standardize what is being done around the world. They're also looking at MEDRA coding. MEDRA is the medical dictionary for regulatory activities. Basically a standardized medical terminology that helps facilitate sharing medical information and medication events, including patient medical histories and adverse event information across the world. So they're working on training people on how to appropriately code. So anybody who's ever coded medication events or med errors knows that events coming from different areas or different regions, different people are essentially different languages. So trying to consolidate that into a single language so that it can be easily monitored and tracked is very important. They're also working on their AM2P program, which is the American Program in Pharmacovigilance, which is working to train people in pharmacovigilance on the American continent, and similar to what they're doing in Europe with their EU2P program. And they're collaborating with ISMP on all these programs as well. All right. So in looking into ISOP prior to going to that meeting, it was very interesting to see that ISOP and ISMP were both formed right around the same time. So 1992, the European Society for Pharmacovigilance, which later became ISOP, was founded in Paris. While here in the States, in Pennsylvania, ISMP was founded in 1994. Both with, again, similar goals for increasing patient safety. All right. So at the conference, myself and our president, Rita Ju, were able to discuss some of our recommendations for how we can collaborate between ISOP and ISMP. So we took a look at our medication safety best practices at ISMP and figured that was a good starting point. And of course, I'll show the slide again. We will look to balance our recommendations with capabilities around the world. I'm going to just skip over a few slides here just for the sake of time, but so a little bit of background here on the ISMP targeted medication safety best practices. Started in 2014, we update them every 2 years. And really they come through to us and we come up with them based on medication safety events that are reported to us, whether they're through our medication error reporting program, vaccine error reporting, or things that we get through external resources. So the first best practice we looked at that we thought would go global, which already is the one we discussed earlier with the vinca alkaloids in mini bags instead of syringes. Again, we looked at sequestering and safe use of neuromuscular blockers, which we're looking to do as this year's IMSN project. We then looked at making sure that liter bags of sterile water were not available on patient care units. So this is something we've worked on here in the States, and we acknowledge that sometimes these products are available in bags versus bottles in other parts of the world, but my challenge to you would be to look and see what these look like in your part of the world, whether they're bags or bottles, and do they look similar to dextrose solutions or other sodium chloride solutions where they might be mistakenly used in a patient, which can cause serious harm and death. And then the last one we discussed, which is really embodied that discussion and this one, is seeking out and using information from external resources to identify risks before they happen at your institution or in your country, and for this sake of this discussion. So looking for ways to collaborate around the world was one of the best ones we came up with. All right. So I'll move on here, just quickly go through the World Health Organization has been a United Nations agency dedicated to advancing health for all since 1948, which is a rather broad goal in my mind. Medication safety is, of course, a part of that goal. And they have multiple different arms working for WHO. I'm not a WHO expert, but I have worked with some of their initiatives and very interesting things, and we'll discuss some in the coming slides here as well. So this past September, WHO celebrated its Patient Safety Day with a theme of medication safety, medications without harm. And they really were looking at ways to advance medication safety on a global scale. And it was a way to supplement or scale up their global patient safety challenge from 2017, Medications Without Harm. They had 4 main pillars: healthcare professionals, medicines, systems and practices of medicines, and patients and the public. And this infographic describes that strategic framework of those pillars that WHO put forward. It really shows all the different important factors that are involved with providing medications without harm. And I think the big takeaway for me for this infographic is that it's a good visual representation of why we need multiple global organizations with a focus on different slices of this pie. This is too much for one organization to tackle on its own. So folks looking at different pieces of this and working together is the essence of what we need to do to improve global medication safety. All right, I'll talk briefly about SIOMS. So SIOMS, as I mentioned earlier, is not a part of WHO, but was established jointly by the WHO and United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization back in 1949. Essentially, their mission is to advance public health through guidance on health research, including ethics, medical product development, and safety. And we'll see here on the next slide. Just recently, they released a new report on patient involvement in development, regulation, and safe use of medicine. So this highlights one of those 4 Ps we talked about earlier, namely that healthcare should be participatory. So systematic involvement and consideration of patients, not just in their care, but throughout the entire medication use cycle, beginning with research and development and onward, is incredibly important. So this report should prompt readers to implement their best practices, recommendations, according to how well they fit into their organization and their national needs. So very interesting read on how to get patients involved from the very beginning of a medication's life cycle. All right, and lastly, we'll talk about UMC, or the Uppsala Monitoring Center, which has provided operational support for the WHO program for international drug monitoring for more than 40 years. They just celebrated their Med Safety Week about a month ago. I will say, if you follow them on LinkedIn, they have some very interesting animations that provide education to patients and practitioners on the basics of pharmacovigilance and that importance of reporting ADRs. So one of the focuses of UMC is, or their focuses are pharmacovigilance research, the development of products, and nurturing collaborations across the world. And ultimately, they support the global data sharing for national level adverse effects of special interest and adverse effects of following immunization. And they do this through several products. The first is they utilize WHO drug, first of all, which is that dictionary of medicinal products, similar to MedDrug, but this one really focuses on having standardized names for medications. So as we talked about earlier with acetaminophen versus paracetamol, reports coming in with those 2 medications might cause confusion when trying to look at the data. So WHO drug looks to standardize that name to harmonize the databases so it can better to run that data. But UMC collects a lot of medication events through various forms. So VigiFlow is essentially a national level case report database. So it allows individual countries to record through electronic means their adverse events that they're seeing. Those can then be transmitted to VigiBase, which is a centralized global database of all of those events. They can be then analyzed both on a national and global scale using the Visualize system. And then Vigi Access gives the ability to make that information public, to show that information out to the world. Most recently, they came out with Vigi Mobile, which allows for tracking of ADRs and medication events in areas where you might not have internet service, and then do that on an electronic device and then have them uploaded once services then regained. So this is going to help, again, with some of those areas of the world that maybe didn't have tracking systems previously. And one of the nice things that they did during COVID was they made this information trackable, not only by country, but not only by medication, but by specific type of vaccine. So this was very large for identifying those medication events that were occurring with very specific types of COVID vaccines, rather than grouping all vaccines into one bucket. So really, again, the work that was done to make that data usable in a time of crisis was very, very incredible. So that brings us back to this graphic. Hopefully you've seen how these organizations work separately and together to work towards the common goal of making medication use systems safer across the globe. So we really do call on the entire global healthcare community to continue helping organizations like ISMP, IMSN, ISOP, and the WHO by reporting medication events and sharing best practices, so we can all continue to learn from one another and ensure powerful lessons from errors can be heard around the globe. We'll see here, we can replace that circle with that graphic there now with from the WHO. So as I promised, these are all the websites that we have for the different organizations that we discussed today. And at this time, I'll bring Matt back in, and I think we can go through some questions.
Thanks, Tyler, for the presentation. I'd like to remind people, if you have any questions related to this topic today about the International Med Safety Update, please put them in the Q&A box. In the meantime, Tyler, I have 2 questions I'm going to ask you for the audience. First, what can the individual practitioners on this call today do to help advance global patient safety goals?
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, it doesn't need to be very big. It can be starting small. Really, just reporting medication errors and adverse reactions is incredibly important. So giving us that information as it comes through, but also educating and empowering your patients to do the same. So these systems do rely on individual reports, as we talked about. So having practitioners and patients reporting is incredibly valuable. And then also look for external reports, like we talked about. Find ways to proactively implement safety in your care setting, and look for tools and recommendations on the websites that we provided. Follow us at ISMP, obviously, but look for those external sources to improve safety where you live. And then look for and speak up about perceived unsafe, risky situations. So wherever you work, if you see a risk, call it out, try and fix it, and then share what you did with the community.
Thanks, Tyler. One more question here. How can the listeners get information about the presentations you saw from ISOP and IMSN annual conferences?
Yeah, so ISOP is an organization that membership is available to individual providers. So if you go to their website, you should be able to submit a request to become a member. You'll have to purchase it. It's not free, of course, but it gives you should give you access to, I believe, the annual meeting presentations, as well as some of their other publications. Unfortunately, IMSN membership is limited to healthcare safety organizations, representative of individual countries. So we don't offer, right now at least, availability for individual practitioners to become members. So really that information, including contact information for your member countries, is available on the IMSN website. And then you can reach out to those organizations to see how you might be able to assist or get information directly from them.
So I just want two questions I want to paraphrase from the box here before we close shop here. One, when you were at the conference, when we talked about the reporting of COVID vaccine and effects, did they comment about the differences in reporting among countries? Because some countries, Tyler, didn't mandate or have people of certain ages get the vaccine. Some European countries discouraged the vaccine for people less than 40, but yet the United States encouraged it literally for everybody. Was there any comments at the meeting about that?
I know there was discussion about differences in how different countries approached vaccination. I know one of the discussions that came up during when we were talking about that communicating risk and crisis was whether we thought that mandating vaccines actually decreased acceptance of the vaccine in certain areas. And there were folks from Europe who were saying that they didn't have mandates, but people were coming out to get the vaccine, so they didn't feel like they needed to be mandated. So definitely differences in how different areas of the world approached vaccination. But as far as how that affected compliance in different parts of the world or event reports coming out, I can't say exactly what was discussed there.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. And I want to say Brian put something in the Q&A box about ISOP has a free YouTube channel where there's a library of many presentations. And the ISOP annual meeting presentations were published in the Journal of Drug Safety. So thank you, Brian, for that as well. So on that note, we're getting close to time here. So again, I want to thank the Novartis Name Creation Regulatory Strategy for sponsoring this program today. I'll let everyone know our next ISMP webinar will take place in January, in the middle of January. And we'll discuss our upcoming targeted medication safety best practices, but specific for outpatient pharmacy. So there's going to be brand new targets that are going towards the outpatient community. So please be aware of that. It'll be on our website. Someone asked a question about the recording for this webinar. It will be available on the website for this program today. Just give us some time to download it and post it on the website. But you can get a recording of that later on, sometime probably this week. So be on the lookout for that as well. So on that note, I want to thank Tyler and thank all participants again for joining us for today's program. We hope to see you again the next time, and this now concludes our webinar.